right, hello, hi, and welcome to Give Your Databases the Protection to Stand Up to Any Threat. Now, today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am absolutely thrilled to be your moderator for this webinar because I have to be honest, I find zero trust absolutely fascinating. I mean, really, all of security programming and planning is pretty interesting, right? But there's just something about the various layers and the holistic nature of zero trust. Maybe it's the psychology of it. I don't know exactly what it is, but I find it so interesting and it never stops evolving, does it? And that's what we're going to dig into today, the evolving nature of zero trust and how you can use this approach to protect your databases. And in even better news, we have some expert help here with us today because we will be chatting with a top expert from Rubrik who will guide us through this layered and fascinating conversation. This is going to be a great day. I cannot wait to get started. So I'm going to zip through a few of the important housekeeping points and get us on our way. So let's take a little guided tour of your audience console, and we'll start out by taking a look at the questions section. Now, this is the best place to get involved, get interactive, and post all of your insightful questions, your comments, your feedback, your ideas. We absolutely want to hear from you. All of that happens in that questions window. It is also a place that you can let us know if there are any little tech gremlins in the system today, knock on wood, of course. Now, I do want to remind you that a browser refresh is going to clear out most of those issues. But if that doesn't work for you, you can post a message in that questions tab and the Actual Tech Media crew will be there to help you out. All right, so if you haven't already said hi and hello, you can give it a test run right now. Say hi, say hello. David says the concept of zero trust is the holy grail of security. That's why it's interesting. I totally agree with you, David. That is a fantastic starting point here. We are on the hunt for the holy grail today. Now, I do want to also bring your attention on over to the handout section right next to the questions tab in your console. You're going to see some exciting content to go along with the webinar today. This handouts window is packed with good stuff to read this afternoon or on any of those future rainy spring afternoons that we might have coming our way. So first up, the Gorilla Guide on Database Protection in 2021. You can explore how cloud has changed database backup and recovery, top challenges for database backup and recovery today, and what a great database backup and recovery solution looks like. Also, check out the Database Protection for Dummies. I love this whole series. You can learn how to automate discovery and protection, gain near zero recovery time objective or RTO, and have full control over those recoveries. Super important. Last but not least, an ebook, Zero Trust Data Security for Databases. Keep your databases running in the face of any threat. Such an interesting read and an absolutely fabulous follow-up to the discussion that we're going to have here today. So be sure to snag those for some reading later on. I told you that handout section was absolutely packed with info. And hey, it is not just awesome content we are giving away today. We also have a $250 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Now, of course, you must be in live attendance during the webinar in order to qualify to win, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you're not sure what those are, no problem. We have the full T's and C's linked for you in the handouts tab, so you can go check them out there. Speaking of prizes, all right, so not only does asking questions today help guide our speakers, bring up the whole energy of the entire webinar with us all today, engaging with our community, it is also a great chance to win a prize. Today we are offering a $50 Amazon gift card to the best question asked. We will review all of the questions asked after we wrap. So even if your question does not get asked in our live Q&A session as we wrap up the presentation, your question is still entered to win. And on that note, we will be sending all questions asked over to the Rubrik team. So stay tuned for that because you will get answers and follow-ups from Rubrik after we wrap as well. Okay, well, that was it for the housekeeping. We went through that very quickly. I told you I would keep it short and sweet, and we are ready to kick things off. I am so excited to introduce you all to Sean McElhenney, Database Solutions Architect at Rubrik. Sean, I know you have some really interesting information to cover with us today. I know you want to get into some questions with the audience, so let's kick things off. Take it away, Sean.
Hi, and welcome to the session on how to give your database the protection to stand up to any threat. My name's Sean McElhenney. I'm a database solutions architect here at Rubrik, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about this topic today. Let's take a quick look at what we're going to chat about. Really, this session, in essence, we're going to be talking about the problem of how companies need to be able to prevent every exploit that's out there. But really, an attacker only needs to be successful with a single exploit in order to breach your system. Now, we have to start thinking about the policies, processes, and procedures we need to assess to try to prevent that from happening. And then once we've identified those solutions, what do we need to focus on to implement them? Over the course of the past few years, everyone's seen how critical data is to business activities and how susceptible this is to attack. Security researchers have said for several years now that two types of organizations exist: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. Here's something new to chew on. Last week, the Rorsa malware came out, and it's going out and has encrypted roughly 220,000 files in just about 270 seconds. That's almost twice as fast as Lockbit. Now, compare that to how customers are still averaging days to try to detect an exploit, and you see that there is a massive risk there. And that leads into the fact that a standard defense in depth policy really doesn't stop everything. Our technical solutions can only take us so far. Ultimately, they're dependent on human interaction for some level of data input, analysis, and maintenance. The fact of the matter is that humans do indeed make mistakes, unless they're DBAs, because we're perfect. Now, how do we fix this fundamental issue? Attacks typically have one common theme. They want to impact our data in some form, whether that be exfiltration, ransom, denying access, etc. If we want to minimize risk, we need to move beyond the basic defense in depth concepts and move towards security at the point of data. Some of the best ways to address this are implementing a zero trust framework throughout our development lifecycle and data lifecycle, and then implementing migration plans to either prevent an attack or deal with an attack once it's occurred. So we're going to dig into a lot of those primary areas of mitigation in this session, talking mainly about proactive mitigation, the insurance type mitigation, basically look at how do we CYA when we know something's going on, and then reactive mitigation, what do we do in the middle of an attack? Let's dig in. We'll start with proactive mitigation. Proactive mitigation focuses our efforts on tasks that can be done to prevent an attack from being successful. This is not a simple activity when it comes to database threats, as databases span multiple areas. We have the infrastructure, our authentication processes, our authorization processes, the data lifecycle itself, where is our data, before it's destroyed, and ultimately our databases are accessed by some type of application. So how are we managing that design and usage? So with these items in mind, what should we really be focusing on to help companies maximize their data security? We can start with infrastructure. Think about the various components that make up most corporate infrastructure. You have hardware vendors, and those hardware vendors may have BIOS or firmware updates. We often forget about this stuff. And when those patches come out, they tend to have security updates that patch real low-level exploits that can do a lot of damage. Our operating system vendors are constantly reviewing the threats against them. They'll run red and blue team tests to try to find holes and patch them. They'll have bug bounty programs that'll help with this too. And with all of the information they aggregate, they will put fixes out to the OS and release quarterly or monthly patches, or even more frequently depending on the severity of of the breach found. These security updates are going to be critical to keeping an OS hardened against specific threats. Hypervisors. If you're working in a virtualized environment, hypervisors become an additional point of entry. Really, a hypervisor is a system that has its own operating system and application, and they contain their own set of exploits as a result. Think about the recent exploit that affected vCenter. Thankfully, VMware was able to work fast and get a workaround and a patch out so that customers that could patch that exploit quickly. Database platforms, SQL Server and Oracle are prime examples. They release security updates in addition to what your OS updates might be. This will ensure that you've got a secure platform and that your RDBMS engine is also patched to prevent certain exploits. Sometimes you'll see these come out more frequently depending on the criticality of the patch and the exploit that they're closing. But as a general rule, you'll see them coming out on a monthly or quarterly basis. So I'm sure at this point you're thinking to yourself, goodness, this is a great deal of patching. How should I manage my limited set of resources to prioritize these patching efforts? And really, this is all about risk mitigation. Each of the patch sets should be reviewed to assess really what's pertinent to your environment and prioritize their implementation based on the risk associated with the exploit. Obviously, high risk exploit, you want to get the patches in for that as quickly as possible. Now, knowing when to patch and what to patch is great, but what do we need to do to make sure that we have the correct resources actually performing the patching? This is where authentication starts to enter the picture. We nearly need the ability to confirm an individual's identity, and that way we can start limiting attack vectors based on that. So probably the biggest one that you hear about lately is the concept of multi-factor authentication. That's where we take two or more items to try to verify your identity. So we're going to use something like a password or a PIN. Then we're going to use something you have, like a smartphone, USB key, something of that sort, that can generate like a time-based one-time password. And then ultimately something you are, like fingerprint, facial recognition, etc. Big thing to remember with time-based one-time passwords is you really don't want to use SMS text messages. They're too easily spoofed, they're too easily exploited. So stay away from SMS texts for a time-based one-time password authentication. Another item to consider is how passwords are being stored. Right? We don't want to be storing passwords in plain text. If they're stored in plain text and the system is compromised, they're sitting there ripe for the taking. Ideally, you want to hash passwords and store them in some type of vault. Whether that be another database, whether it be a third-party vaulting software, something of that nature, so that way those passwords are secure and can't be exploited easily. Now, next thing to think about is how we structure our password policies. Thing to consider here is password length is going to be more important than password complexity in the modern age. Right? Because password patterns are created by users, a lot of password crackers have adopted quickly and can easily crack passwords, say, like password 123 exclamation point. So by making the password longer and moving towards something along the lines of a passphrase, it's going to make it much more difficult for a password cracker to crack such a password. Another item to consider is the concept of the breach password list. So you have a blacklist of passwords that have been compromised. And when a user goes to set their password, you compare that against this blacklist. If it matches an entry on the blacklist, the password's denied, the user has to select a new password. There's also the concern with periodic resets. This is a very debatable concept, and there are people that almost view this like religion. So the concept here is you need to have that password reset every 30, 60, 90, 180 days, as an example. Really, if you're getting longer passwords into the mix where you're moving toward that passphrase, the need to change at a higher frequency becomes less important. Mind you, I didn't say doesn't become important, because there should be some password changes as part of the lifetime of an account. The big thing here is the higher the frequency of password resets, the more likely a user is to write the password down, store it somewhere that can be easily compromised, and then all the complexity you've put in place for the passwords is lost because the password itself was written down and grabbed. Another item to consider are tokens and certificates. Right? We want to make sure we're not hard coding anything like that into an application. Because once it's there, again, not much different than a password. Now I can take that and I can log into the system. You really need to treat tokens like you would passwords. Protect them the same way, and then ultimately look at token like a certificate where it has a certain lifespan. And then after that lifespan has been met, the password expires and the token rotates. Here's several blog posts that might help you if you're looking for some assistance in your authentication design process. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, if we follow the references and the standards that I've mentioned here, once you authenticate, you should be able to do whatever you want, right? No, not quite. What we don't want is to be able to have a user authenticate to the system and then have carte blanche on everything. So we really need to make sure we're assigning and managing privileges effectively. We want to avoid things like excessive privileges. This is where the concept of least privilege comes into play. We want to know what is the minimal amount of access I need to be able to do my job function. Then we need to look at, in our system, how many people have elevated access to the database. So that's the scenario where, I might be an end user, but I've got DBA level access. Why do I need that? Simple answer is I don't. When we look at the next point, we start talking about, do our admins have the ability to change data? And then should they be able to change that data? Right? As a DBA, I shouldn't be able to go in and access the business data and manipulate it. And if I do have the ability to do that, how are those activities being audited? Lastly, we got to look at who, as a part of their job responsibility, has admin or root access to the databases and the hosts. And then really start determining, is that something that they really need? Because if we don't, we run into a lot of problems with abuse of privileges. So this could be where you have the rogue admin, someone who has this level of access and is going to go out and do a malicious act. Similar concept would be you may have a responsible admin, but has poor password policies and somehow gets that account compromised. And now that account can be used maliciously to do damage. The other consideration, what about people that have changed job roles? If I'm start working in HR and I've been with a company for a few years and then I move over to a role in finance, or another role that's not maybe in legal, who knows? I don't need access to my HR role anymore. So is that being revoked? And that's the next big thing, is as we do this and people move throughout the company, are we ensuring that they only have the role they need and their old accesses are being taken away? Lastly, the concept of the abandoned privilege. This could be where you've got users' accounts still active for a system that is no longer actively used, or you've got the scenario of a user who has left the company but their accounts have not been expired. So those accounts still have full access and the user's no longer with the organization. Very big risk there. Now, I'm sure it sounds like I'm creating a lot more work for the DBA here. In reality, our job is just to keep the database online and keep things processing as quickly as possible, right? Security should be somebody else's problem to deal with. Now, I'd argue that the DBA's role is critical to ensuring the security of data throughout the data lifecycle. So think about these items relative to your current environment. Things like knowing where your data lives. How many copies of the database are out there? Think about your backups. Think about clones. Think about a DR site. Any replication you have going on. Then think about the backups themselves. Are they replicated to multiple locations? Do you have one that's, say, on-prem and then another one that's your rescue copy that's off another disk and another one that gets shipped off to a third location? What about if you're doing updates to data in a live database? Odds are you're making a copy of the table really quick as a backup before you edit the data. Are you cleaning that up when you're done? I know personally, for years, I would end up have to do that on a quarterly basis because I'd go out and do a bunch of stuff and fix some code and make sure everything worked properly, and then forgot I had these backup tables out there. So then you got to go back and clean them up. Ideally, you want to do that, test it works, delete it. That way you don't have all these other copies of the database of the tables out there that could put you at risk. Now, think about sensitive data. Do you know what sensitive data or if sensitive data exists in your database? Going to be a critical thing because that's going to really dictate the type of protections you need to have in place. So think about, if I've got PII, PHI, HIPAA data, I need to protect that differently than I would some general externally available data. Following on with that, if we're doing things like database exports or somehow pulling data out of the database, are they getting stored in flat files and not being secured? If they are, and a host or an operating system gets compromised, doesn't matter how tight you've got the database protection, you now have a flat file sitting there that has a ton of data in it that somebody can just pick up and walk off with, essentially. And then you can consider, the non-DBA's favorite database, which is a spreadsheet. How much data is in that? What data is in that? How can it be protected? You want to try to get away from that spreadsheet concept, keep the data where it's secured, run it through reports and stuff in the system so that way you can maintain some level of security around the data. Next thing we need to look at is our storage media. Right? Who has access to the data files? Is there anybody beyond the DBA and the SA that have the ability to look at it? What about the backups? Where do those backups live? Who has access to that? And really, when we go beyond access, who has the ability to delete data or backups or data files or entire databases? You got that in the wrong hands, that's how your ransomware event really takes off. Because they can delete the backups, then they have the ability to manipulate the data files, and you no longer have access to your data. And lastly, consider physical access to the storage itself. Can someone walk into a data center and rip a disk out of a server and then pop it in somewhere else and use it? If they can, you've lost that data forever, and it's now out in the world. The last thing we need to think about here is data placement. How are we managing our secure data versus our external data? That secure data could be anything from, regulated data like I mentioned earlier with PCI, PHI, HIPAA, etc. Or it could just be internal confidential data. If we have that data coexisting with externally accessible data, we're setting ourselves up for a breach. We want to make sure we've got some degree of separation in there and protections around that data that we need to have secured, and we don't want to have accessed externally. So that way you can try to prevent a lot of those problems before they happen. So if you think about it from a security perspective, you can really say that the DBA's ultimate responsibility is maintaining the three primary pillars of security, which is confidentiality, data integrity, and data availability. And that's across the entire data lifecycle. But what are we supposed to do about those access points that we have no control over, like the applications that generate and manipulate the data we're trying to protect? This is where secure development practices really become important. Some of the larger tasks we need to consider here include data masking. So that should be something that's supplementing how we secure our sensitive data. So you may have something along the lines of row-level security to limit who can see it based on their role in the organization, and then having data masking that prevents anybody from viewing it that doesn't need to see it at all. Then when data is at rest, how are we storing it? If we have sensitive data that needs to be protected, shouldn't be in clear text, all that data should be encrypted at rest. That way, when you think about the scenario I presented about somebody going into the data center and stealing a disk, that data is all, if all the sensitive data on that disk is encrypted, they don't have anything that they can work with. Next application consideration is database or SQL injection. So think about the accounts that the applications use to access the system. Are they service accounts? Do they have elevated permissions? Shouldn't be any different than the concept of least privilege that you're using for your standard users. Then ultimately, how does the application actually access the data in the database? Is it using database procedures, which you can extrapolate certain things from, and that way make sure that you're only getting the data that you want this particular query to be able to access and nothing more? Or does the application query database tables directly? If it's doing the latter, you're setting yourself up for a SQL injection attack, where somebody can go in and manipulate that query and get data they're not supposed to have access to. And probably the biggest thing that you want to be looking at is auditing. So usage auditing from an application side is going to be critical, because that's going to help with forensics in the event something bad happens. When we start talking about audits in general, we really need to be working with our audit teams. They have a broader scope and understanding of the security environment than we likely have as DBAs. So we want to take their findings and considerations very closely and try to work with them. When we start talking about an internal audit team, right, really they have the same goals as we do. It's all about ensuring the data security of the company. The more you interact with them, the greater your chances are of success. Now, when we start talking about external audits, that can be a stressful event. But if you work with those audit teams, you can really learn what's of interest and ensure that you're properly prepared, because those audit teams are going to various customers and are seeing what the common themes are for compromises. So if they're coming in and they say, here are the items that we're most concerned with, and you've got most of that covered, that lets them focus on some of the finer things that could be putting you at risk. So you can get more comprehensive protection from that. Auditors are not the enemy. Now that we have an idea of what can be done to limit the attack surface area, we can move on to some of the steps we can take to ensure our downtime is minimized in the event of an attack. So I'll let you in on a dirty little secret here. if you want to eliminate the chance for a breach, all you need to do is fire the janitor. That guy is always ignoring security requirements. You know, if it was only that simple. The point here is, we always have to consider the human element and what that means to an organization. So we might be able to eliminate this threat in a small company, but what happens when you have 100 employees, or 1,000 employees, or 10,000 plus employees? The simple reality is we'll never be able to fully eliminate the human threat. So what do we really do? Simply put, we need an insurance policy that can protect us from the impact of human activities. If you think about it, right, an insurance policy in its most basic form is designed to protect us against certain risks. So proactive mitigation is the equivalent to an insurance inspector reviewing your property and telling you you need to fix this to maintain coverage. But reality is someone inevitably will get hurt on your property, and your insurance policy is going to cover you if, for example, someone falls down your stairs. But what kind of insurance can an organization carry to help protect their databases? That insurance policy is a backup, but really backups are a means to an end. What you really need is the ability to recover. So our efforts should focus on a recovery strategy, not a backup strategy. Think about things like, what are we trying to recover from? Is it row-level data loss, table loss? Have we lost an entire database, a data file, an entire system? Has the data center gone down? These type of events will really tell us how we need to back up our environment. Another thing that might come up is how most business owners and system owners will say they want zero data loss. Well, when they say this, it becomes our job to research what that will cost. And when we figure that out, we need to show them the bill. Because when they see the bill, they may say, you know what, yes, this data is absolutely worth it. We're making the funds available for it. Make it happen. But if they can't afford it, then it's time to step back and say, okay, well, what can we actually tolerate for loss here? So, you can start building recovery rules to ensure that you can hit those targets. For example, a 15-minute RPO for your critical applications and the databases that support it. Once you have your recovery strategy in place, now you really need to test it, right? That'll confirm, is it capable of meeting the business requirements? And simply one and done in this scenario is not enough. A test strategy needs to be developed. Environments change over time. Did a corrupt block get written to the backup? Has the size of the database or application changed, and will that prevent us from hitting our RPO? If that's the case, what adjustments do we need to make? The only way you find that out is through testing. Another thing you need to think about is how quickly can you retrieve those backups? Is it on isolated warm or hot storage? Or is it off somewhere on cooled cold storage? Or is it even in the data center that you need to use it in? Then also think about, if you're not in a virtualized environment and you're using bare metal, there's a ton of details that you can overlook there. So testing the process out will really help flush a lot of that out. So I'm sure most of us leverage tabletop exercises to walk through a lot of this because a full-blown recovery test is a pretty large undertaking. This is really where the concept of Rubrik's Zero Trust Data Security model is most beneficial. You can consolidate, protect, and automate your entire database landscape and then have granular control for access to the various components in your solution stack, right? Then run your tabletop exercises to identify and refine your processes and leverage Rubrik to actually do recovery testing at scale using our live mount technology. On that note, Rubrik is really designed with recovery at top of mind. You define an SLA to protect your database objects and your applications. Then you can leverage, the wealth of recovery options that are available to meet any recovery scenario you encounter. You can use Rubrik's automated recovery for most use cases, or you can simply stage the files that you need to recover and use native tooling for your database to manage the recovery yourself. Covered quite a bit, covering it pretty quick. So what we know about now is we know about the steps we should take to prevent an attack and the resources we need to ensure we can recover from an attack. Now let's start digging into what we should be doing during an attack. Ideally, the Borg hasn't compromised your system, but the fact of the matter is that breaches are going to happen. And the key to minimizing the impact of a breach is how you respond to it. So what should companies and their staff do when they discover an attack? Really, you need to keep a level head when an attack happens. Focus on some of the following activities. Determining what the affected assets are. Doing data analysis to determine what's good and what isn't. Figuring out what the blast radius is. How many assets were actually affected. Based on the affected data, what recovery steps do we need to take? And now, let's look at the scope of that recovery. Do we need to recover an entire VM, a file, a database, tables, records, hardware, or what have you? Next, we look at our recovery plan. Recovery plan should have runbooks in it, so that way we have an exact step-by-step execution that needs to be done, so we don't have to panic and think outside the box to try to work through an issue when a crisis is on. Knowing the recovery times will be extremely helpful for assessing the duration of an outage and if things are going right or not. That's where the recovery testing is becoming critical. The other thing is recovery isolation. Being able to sandbox that recovery to a controlled environment, or a clean room, if you will, before putting the data back into production will help you determine, am I working with a clean state? Or am I going to do something that's going to reinfect my entire system after recovery? The other nice thing with sandboxing is that it helps with forensics after the event too. Think about recovery tools. Do you have backups that you can recover from? In most ransomware attacks, the backups are gone, so now you're out of luck. So you need to make sure you've got the tooling in place to have the backups to recover from. You need to be able to stop operational activity against that database. We don't want to have operational tasks going on. We don't want to have backups running until we confirm the data is in a good state. And we certainly don't want to delete the data because we may end up destroying forensic evidence. Lastly, we want to make sure we've got clear and concise communication plans and documentation. Everyone needs to know what the process is and what the recovery options are. That goes from the C-suite down to the help desk. If you think about it, this sounds really similar to how an elite athlete might train. You got to know what you need to do. You work with the tools you have and you practice until it becomes muscle memory. But what happens when there's something wrong with how you're training? This is where the concept of a postmortem is critical. We really need to understand the following. One, what happened? Did proactive steps that we have in place fail? What about tools? Does the tooling we used, did something fail there? Any systems, procedures, and processes that failed? But we also need to look at what went right. Did we have systems that scaled or automated solutions that captured a lot of the information? Was there some variation in the event that differed from what we were planning for. So knowing what you accounted for versus what you haven't accounted for, you may be able to isolate some changes you need to make to the plan. Then thinking about the ROI on your plan versus what happened. Did the plan and the execution give you the benefits that you expected? If not, really, what do you need to change? Is there a change in process? Is there a change in technology, a change in tooling that you need to do to really support this and keep you moving forward? Again, covering a lot of material here, so let's recap with some key takeaways for you. Probably the biggest thing, work with your organization's security teams to try to prevent a breach. It isn't realistic to think you're going to be able to stop every attack vector. You need to ensure that you protect your critical assets and have a mechanism to return them to service quickly. And lastly, panic under stress, your worst enemy. Having the plan isn't enough. You need to be able to execute the plan regularly and revise it when it's necessary. Having a comprehensive response plan ensures that all the participants know their role and what they need to do, and then testing the plan in a controlled fashion enables everyone to understand what is expected of them and how they need to execute. If you're interested in a little more product detail, I strongly recommend that you keep an eye out for some of our virtual events. They'll let you get hands-on and play with the product, and you can see it in action for yourself. I've also put some resources on here for a couple ebooks that cover modern data protection solutions for databases and how to recover from ransomware if you're interested in a little more information. Speaking of virtual events, you may want to consider registering for Forward, our annual user conference. You'll have the opportunity to learn about our product direction, new features, and hear real-world customer feedback on how they're leveraging our products. I will admit, unfortunately, I was booked this year, so I couldn't do the keynote. So I hope you're okay with settling with Ryan Reynolds as the keynote speaker for this. I know, close second to me, but it's okay. And with that, I really want to thank you for joining me today. If you have some questions, fire away. Looks like we have one coming in. You mentioned Zero Trust Framework, but I didn't really see where this is implemented in Rubrik. Can you elaborate? Okay. The concept here is Rubrik trusts no one and nothing. So communications between Rubrik and the hosts are all facilitated by the Rubrik backup service, which gets deployed from an individual cluster. All those comms are secured and they're all logged. Now, because they're logged, that enables auditing on them. Then, from the Rubrik application perspective, we harden it via MFA and granular RBAC so we can control authorization and protect resources so that you can limit access. And there's a ton of other features that we have to support the concept of zero trust, but that really is a whole other session. So if you want to learn more about it, feel free to check out the Rubrik website and dig into some of the blog posts where they'll have some very nuanced blog posts on specifics within the zero trust architecture. Another question that came in is, how long does it take to protect a database with Rubrik? A lot of that's going to depend on the scale of the system. So I'm an Oracle DBA, was for years. So I do a lot of work with our Oracle solution. And so we'll look at that as an example. Cradle to grave, you're going to start out creating an SLA domain that creates that protection policy for your databases. Assuming you know your backup frequency, your retention, and your log backup frequency and retention, you can create an SLA domain in a matter of minutes. Then you're going to deploy the Rubrik backup service to the host that your databases are running on. And that's an extremely short exercise. That's typically up and running in 2 minutes or less. When you discover the host within Rubrik, this is what might take a little bit of time, because you're going to feed it either the fully qualified host name or the IP address, and then the owner of your Oracle binaries. Depending on the number of databases that are running on a particular host, that discovery process, could take minutes. Single minutes could take several. Let's assume we're talking about a host with 5 databases. Typically, with what I've seen, that would be about 5-10 minutes worth of time. Then lastly, you would assign the SLA at either the host or the individual database level, and that literally takes seconds. And then Rubrik takes over the protection from there. So for this particular exercise, going from SLA creation through discovery and SLA assignment took less than an hour. Customers with a substantial database landscape may opt to use automation for a lot of the discoveries and would use our API calls to make that happen and eliminate manual interaction entirely. So you could automate the entire deployment process across your entire enterprise in relatively short order. Not seeing any other questions come in at this point. So with that, again, I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for attending.
Oh man, Sean, thank you so much for leading us through that really fascinating exploration of zero trust and database protection strategies. I do see that there were some questions that we didn't get to that Sean doesn't have time to dig into today. But Sean, we're going to make sure that those get to you and to the Rubrik team. So for anyone out there that did ask a question that we didn't have time to dig into, rest assured that you will get some answers back about those after we've wrapped up. And all of you who asked a question out there are entered to win that best question gift card. So stay tuned for that, because we will be following up with you. Now, speaking of best question gift cards, you might be saying to yourself, what about the prize giveaway? And you'd be absolutely right. It is time for the prize giveaway. So I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But I do want to remind you all, if you were looking for more information right away, a little bit of light reading on a rainy spring afternoon, or some of you are in bright sunshine, and I don't want to talk about it because it's gloomy and gray here today. But for those of you who are looking to stay inside and do some reading, I'm going to remind you to head on over to the handouts tab before we go. Make sure you've got that Gorilla Guide on database protection, looking at how databases have how cloud has changed that, some of the top challenges, and what, of course, a great database backup and recovery solution actually looks like. So that's the Gorilla Guide for you. And the Database Protection for Dummies, again, such a fun series. Get into automation, discovery, and protection, zero recovery time objectives, RTOs, and really getting full control. And then finally, that ebook, Zero Trust Data Security for Databases, keeping your databases running in the face of any threat. That is such an interesting read, and obviously such an important follow-up to our conversation here today. So be sure that you've got all of those handouts from that handouts tab before you head out. Now, I will remind you again that you do need to be here live and present at the webinar in order to qualify to win. And our very next special winner, awesome winner, sorry, I'm reading tiny fine print here, so just think of it as a drum roll, is Tim Paxson from Michigan. Congratulations to Tim Paxson of Michigan. You have won a $250 Amazon gift card, and as always, we will be in touch about claiming your prize after we wrap. All right, folks. Well, I hate to say it, but we are at the end of our time here together. So on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to again thank Rubrik for making this wonderful webinar possible. A giant thank you to Sean for leading us through such an engaging and really interesting conversation today. Now, on that note, also, as always, a big high five to all of you for being here with us today, for making this conversation possible. Again, another wonderful example of the interesting and in-depth learning that can happen when we all pool our information and engage in these discussions together. I know I've learned a ton from all of you, from Sean, and from our discussion today. I hope you all have as well. I can't wait to see you all at a webinar again soon. And until then, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful end to your day.